Okay, we'll get started. And as folks are joining, please rename yourself with your name, your state, if you're a TA provider with your organization, and my federal colleagues with your department and agency to help facilitate the conversation. So hello, Accelerator states, and welcome to our 8th and last learning track session. Can you believe it? In response to your TA needs, this session focuses on strategies for scaling affordable and supportive housing in your states. We'll cover a variety of strategies for leveraging federal funding and finance options to meet the diverse housing and services needs of the individuals that your programs serve. Next slide, please. Today's topic is highly applicable to each of your states, and we'll start with strategies for scaling affordable and supportive housing, and then Maryland will share their recent success. As with our last two sessions, we'll stay together for a large group discussion. Because each of your state has solutions to share, please plan to actively contribute by asking questions and bringing your unique knowledge to the discussion. We're asking that everyone please have your cameras on during the session. We really want to see your beautiful faces, and it really helps to promote an active and engaged conversation. So we thank you in advance for turning your cameras on. Also, please rename your Zoom square so it shows your name and your state. And since we're staying in one room, it also helps our facilitators call on state team members to enrich the discussion. It will help you pay attention to the discussion and get more out of it as well. As in the past, we are recording all parts of the session for note-taking purposes. Please mute your mic unless you're speaking. And while Marilyn presents, put your questions in the chat so we can draw on them. And then we'll also move on to people who have their hands raised. So next slide, please. If there were a Nobel Prize for breakthrough innovations in supportive and accessible housing, Nicole LeBaire would be on the short list, in part because of her leadership in creating a sustainable model in Louisiana after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. Nicole will now set the stage for our session on strategies to scale affordable and supportive housing by leveraging federal programs. And with that, Nicole, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Ryan, and good day, everyone. If we can just go to the next slide, as I am going to talk briefly about scaling permanent supportive housing, and if we could go to the next slide. Just want to start us off with a reminder of an earlier discussion you heard here, and most likely in other spaces, which is that we often think of permanent supportive housing or PSH as a four-legged stool, sometimes a three-legged stool, but creating PSH requires at least one and often four of these. So thinking about that first one as your capital funds to create affordability by decreasing any debt or mortgage. Then your next leg would be your rental or operating subsidy that makes that housing affordable to people who are low, very low income, such as those who rely on Social Security income. Your third leg is your tenancy supports, which is one of the key resources that all the HSPA state Medicaid agencies are hoping to bring to the table. And then what might be new to some is that fourth leg, which is other services that tenants may need or want to live and participate fully in their community, which could be something like mental health, substance abuse, or healthcare services. So over the last months, we've learned about housing and services and braiding the two. So today we're going to be focusing on the housing aspect of PSH and how to scale it up. If we could go to the next slide. So there are many ways you can scale up PSH, and this slide includes a few for your states to consider. So you could be scaling your PSH up through new construction with your state or local housing and service partnerships. Your state could develop new PSH, possibly including single site properties, scattered site properties that have a percentage of units set aside as integrated PSH. This model requires capital sources and rental subsidies so that they are deeply affordable to the people that they serve. You could be looking at existing housing, focusing on providing additional PSH. So for example, you could secure a preference for people experiencing homelessness in existing multifamily housing that already has subsidies in place. And then as we've discussed previously, you could secure a preference for a target population in a rental assistance voucher program, such as mainstream programs. So all of these can help your state scale up permanent supportive housing opportunities. But when you pursue multiple pathways, you can see even more significant results. And if we could go to the next slide. So as your state is scaling PSH, you might want to consider some of these federally funded opportunities. The Home ARP program, which stands for the Home Investment Partnerships American Rescue Plan program, provides funding to home participating jurisdictions that can help reduce homelessness and increase housing stability. These funds can be used to actually develop PSH. They can provide tenant-based rental assistance and supportive services. So this is a great addition as you're looking to scale up PSH. You might also be familiar with Section 8 project rental assistance, which provides project-based rental assistance, often found in tax credit development. But only 25% of the units in a property can be set aside for persons with disabilities, and then those people have to be between the ages of 18 and 62. New in the COC world, we have the COC Build NOFO, Notice of Funding Availability or Opportunity, pardon me, that's out now for COCs, and those applications are due November 21st. So you'd want to move fast on this one if you're not already. And this offers opportunity to partner with COCs and be creative in developing PSH units. You have to serve people experiencing homelessness with high service needs. And this is a really great opportunity for Medicaid to partner with COCs. So just 2 weeks ago, we learned about some new flexibilities with mainstream vouchers that PHAs can use. And mainstream vouchers can be project-based or tenant-based, and PHAs can use preferences to target those vouchers. And lastly, what we're going to talk a little bit more about is the low-income housing tax credit program. So if we could go to the next slide. So any of the opportunities I just mentioned can help your state scale up PSH, but when you pursue multiple pathways, you will see significant results. So in Louisiana, for example, where I previously worked for 10.5 years, we were able to go from 0 PSH units to over 3,000 using the variety of resources that you can see on this slide, including project-based vouchers, COC rental assistance, 811 project rental assistance, mainstream HUD-VASH, stability, EHV, and even some state-funded rental assistance. So the initial resources for the PSH program in Louisiana included the unusual use of community development block grant disaster recovery services that came post-Katrina. And the state worked hard to add to those resources and develop a program that is now available statewide for many different target populations, including people experiencing homelessness or at risk of, and people exiting institutions or those at risk of institutionalization. It took a lot of years, a lot of hard work to develop the systems, the partnerships, and it takes constant work to sustain those partnerships, constant communication. It wasn't easy to develop the initial referral system. We weren't always able to fill all the units that became available, but we continued to refine the systems. Like we didn't need 3 and 4 bedroom units out in the southwestern part of the state. We needed 1 bedroom units. So we learned what it took to be successful. So this is just a picture of a state that is many years into the process of scaling PSH. So soon you're going to hear from Maryland, a state that sees opportunity to start this scaling using the low-income housing tax credit program. The low-income housing tax credit program is also one of the key components of Louisiana's PSH program. The Louisiana Housing Corporation used incentives and threshold requirements to secure PSH and development with those tax credits. So just to add a note though, there are other possible supportive housing options, including recovery housing. Central City Concerns offers a range of successful recovery housing models. And SAMHSA is also another great resource where you can learn more about recovery housing. If we can go to the next slide, please. So you might be asking, what are these mysterious tax credits? And so let's spend a little bit of time learning about them before we hear from Maryland. So there are two types of tax credits, 9% and 4% tax credits. The 9% are really limited in every state. The IRS awards this limited amount per capita to each state, and the 4%, they're not limited, but being 4% versus 9%, they're less valuable for the development. So once a state receives its allocation, it awards the 9% credits to developers through a competitive process. The developers then sell the credits to a corporation or another entity that can benefit from the tax credit. The funds gained from the sale go into the development as equity or capital. Then once that project is occupied, the investor can start to claim the credit on their taxes. So if we go to the next slide, please. So developers must make a commitment to meet at least one of these to be eligible for the 9% credit. So 20% of the units have to be at or below 50% of the area median income, or 40% at 60% of the area median income, but no units will be occupied by tenants with income greater than 80%. So back to Louisiana's post-Katrina tax credit program, we created some really great mixed income developments that had units at the 20% AMI, so they were affordable to people without a subsidy, all the way up to we had market rate units. So it was a beautiful blend of tax credits, community development block grant funds. And if you're ever in New Orleans and you're driving from the city to the airport and you see the Crystal Preserve building, that is one of those piggyback funded properties where we have permanent supportive housing units. There's a rooftop pool. They had all the amazing amenities. It's a great example of how this program can be successful. If we can go to the next slide. So these credits being so valuable for development creates a really competitive process for securing them. So your state housing agency that awards the credits develops what's called the Qualified Allocation Plan, or we like to shorten everything and call it the QAP, which is like really a request for proposals that outlines the agency's priorities and provides additional points in the process for developments that are willing to meet these priorities. These could be things like serving a target population, setting aside units for PSH, adding additional accessibility or universal design, maybe even greener or more sustainable building. So most of the time, really all of the time, developers want the 9% credit so badly, they will agree to meet all of the agency priorities. So, you know, if you say, oh, we want to give points for red roofs and purple buildings and duplexes, that's what you're going to get. The developers will chase the points. So be very thoughtful when you work with your housing agency on what you are trying to create and make sure that it fits the needs of the population that you're serving. So on this page and shared in the chat is a link that will get you to each state's QAP. So with that framework in mind, I'll turn it back over to Ryan so we can transition to Maryland's perspective.
Thanks so much, Nicole. Next slide, please. We really appreciate the grounding you just provided. Now let's warmly welcome and thank our Maryland presenters, Danielle Meister and Gregory Hare from the Maryland Department of Housing and Community Development. They're eager to tell you about their cutting-edge strategy to use low-income housing tax credits to scale up resources, and you'll learn more about other opportunities they are pursuing as well. So please remember to put your questions in the chat, or when we get to the Q&A, raise your hand and we'll call on you to participate in the conversation and discussion. Danielle and Gregory, we're all ears.
Great, thanks so much. We're really excited to share about some of the new developments going on in Maryland around permanent supportive housing and how we're hoping to leverage LIHTC and the QAP process for that. So next slide. And one more. Okay, so just to give you some background around how we got to where we are now, this is all happening in real time. Everything I'm about to share is we are in the middle of our cycle and implementation. And so the last year, essentially year and a half, we had a new governor come in to Maryland, Governor Westmore, and therefore a new administration. And we have been given a clear charge over the last year and a half to address homelessness in a more concrete and specific way. Our governor came in on the campaign of leaving no one behind and with a specific goal around ending child poverty and by effect, also homelessness. And so the administration released the first state plan in over a decade that came out earlier this year. I linked to it in our slides. It's worth a read, I think, for how a state can address multiple priorities at once. But it was sort of the first time in over a decade that all of the state agencies were given a very clear charge for what we should be focused on. There's two major metrics in that plan that are tied to homelessness, both reducing overall homelessness across the state. So for all populations, we want to see reductions. But specifically, we are working towards ending or solving chronic homelessness by 2035. And to help support this goal, as well as in recognition of, we had a new secretary come in who was incredibly passionate about homelessness and came with that perspective to his new appointment. We created a new division within DHTD. So we have always worked on homelessness at DHTD, but we have never been our own division. We've always been nested in other areas of the work. But earlier this year became our own division. I was appointed assistant secretary to help give ourselves more higher profile within state government, more influence over policy and decision making, and really to help facilitate more interagency collaboration. And we staff and coordinate the state's interagency council on homelessness as well. So for us to get to a potential end in chronic homelessness by 2035, we really recognized that the main thing we needed to do was ramp up permanent supportive housing production significantly. And we felt like the state was uniquely equipped to do that in comparison to maybe other interventions like shelter or rapid rehousing. We have a lot of capital development. We have a lot of resources to build units to create more affordable housing. And so we have a special role to play, particularly when it comes to permanent supportive housing. So to reach our goal, we are aiming to get to 500 to 600 new units every year for the next 10 years. Next slide. So going backwards a year or two ago, if you were to look at our housing systems in Maryland when it comes to homelessness, and you're gonna hear me talk a lot about PSH, whenever I'm using that today, generally I'm talking about PSH for homeless households, not necessarily supportive housing for everybody. So we do recognize there's a lot of folks who need supportive housing that are not homeless. People coming out of institutional settings, folks coming out of maybe child welfare systems, and there's a lot of folks who would benefit from supportive housing. But specifically, when we look at supportive housing for homeless households, the state had not taken a very large role in producing that. Literally, I think almost all of the permanent supportive housing for homeless households was coming through either HUD continuum of care funding or the homeless preferences for housing choice vouchers at the local level. So very locally driven resources, which, as I'm sure many of you know, in urban areas might be a little easier than rural areas. So there's sort of disparate production of PSH even within our state. We also didn't have like one single source of funding to support the creation of PSH. Instead of what we had was, small programs here and there amongst many agencies. So you might have Section 811, which is awesome, not specifically geared towards homelessness, but can be used for that. So could be a tool in the toolbox. We do have Money Follows the Person. We have a couple other programs within the state that can be leveraged for that, but we don't have one single source within our state budget specifically targeted towards PSH for homeless households. So that's really where we are trying to make some progress. We also have had a challenge leveraging philanthropic commitments for that long-term need. A lot of our local foundations, while they value and support the production of PSH, the reality is that PSH to be adequately funded is a lifelong commitment to households. And a lot of foundations and a lot of philanthropy, they don't want to make that kind of commitment, and or it requires continual fundraising. So we really recognize that moving forward, this needs to be the role of government. We need to have a dedicated funding source, and philanthropy can be layered in for sure, but can't be the sole source of creation, which is what it was largely in the past, particularly when it came to supportive services. The other thing that was happening and is a major tool in our toolbox we're going to be using going forward is we did finally leverage the Medicaid 1115 waiver back in 2017 to launch our ACES pilot and use those funds for tenancy supportive services and housing-based case management. So we have 4 different continuums of care who are leveraging that now, and we're in the process of expanding statewide and making it more accessible to more service providers. And so many of those COCs leveraged that Medicaid 1115 waiver, and they paired it with site-based PSH. They paired it with housing choice vouchers to create PSH. So we're looking to kind of take that model of braiding all these different funding sources and use that going forward. And then when it comes to our LIHTC resources, we did have a PSH set aside in 2019, and that resulted in one project being awarded, and it created 35 PSH units. So we had dabbled in using LIHTC for PSH, but it hadn't been a formal part of our funding strategy every year. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to kick it over to Greg, but we have a couple specifics for our QAP we thought would be helpful to share as context.
Great. Thank you, Danielle, and good afternoon, everybody. So at a really high level, as Danielle indicated, we do have a lot of tools in the toolkit as relates to creating affordable housing. So in Maryland, some of the states are unique in that they might have a separate housing finance agency, a separate housing credit agency, and even sometimes separate PHAs. We have a lot of large PHAs in the metropolitan areas, but we do serve as the PHA for a large part to Eastern Shore and Western Maryland, which are our rural counties. And then we do have the Housing Finance Agency and the Housing Credit Agency under one roof. And so that allows us to do a couple of things that others might not be able to. And so high level, our competitive tax credits, $16.5 million a year. I think you all know what that equates to, but about $165 million a year in capital to go into affordable housing. And that's, as indicated at the top, it's really competitive to get those credits. Fortunately for Maryland, we do have a robust 4% LIHTC and multifamily bond program. And so that's really where about 75% of our units are created. And so that's an important distinction to make here as to why we took the approach we took. And so with all that collectively, we produce we create and preserve about 4,000 units a year, about $1.1 billion in total project cost. So it's a machine that we think that works for creating affordable housing in Maryland. How we do our QAP, it's obviously a lot of the incentive points are geared towards the 9% credits, but there is some basic threshold requirements, again, which is a part of our strategy here. But our priorities include community context, that is where properties are located, including communities of opportunity, family housing. We focus a lot on income targeting, like many people for our 9% program, to try to really get some deeper affordability. That's really the main tool that we have. And we've always been focused on transit-oriented development, but in Maryland in particular, there's been huge investments around transit hubs across the state in the billions of dollars of range in many of our metropolitan counties. And so we are having a huge focus on TOD as we advance. And so that is what our scoring priorities are in Maryland. The next slide. And so our timeline, we do to get those 4,000 units. We have a pretty tight schedule to try to get things done, but we do try to make this a really a transparent and an open process to the public. And so we always start off every year with listening sessions, and that is really taking feedback from our partners and advocates about the QAP. And after we do that, we use that feedback as well as feedback from the secretary and the administration to release our first draft. And we really leave that open for 30 days for comment period. Our next stage is really and we haven't gotten there just yet, but the idea is to release a second draft of the QAP, and we won't call it final just yet, but we released that second draft of the QAP to make sure we collect that final feedback from folks and to have that public hearing that's required by the Treasury. And so there typically aren't a ton of changes between the second and final draft, which is why we kind of have final draft here. By the time we get to that stage, we want it to really be fully baked because at that point, we want our partners to be preparing to look for sites that meet the requirements that we laid out in the Qualified Allocation Plan. And to make sure, we don't get a lot of applications that fail threshold or miss a lot of information, we do try to give all of our partners 90 days to apply. We say between 75 and 90 days, but we found that if you want to reduce errors, you want to be closer to that 90-day period. And so from there, we do score the applications, make sure they meet our threshold requirements. And we're typically awarding anywhere between 12 and 14, sites a year through the 9% program. And so most of the deals that come through the 9% program are new construction. And so that means, 12 to 18 months before they're ready to, close these deals at a minimum, and then another 18 to 24 months of construction. And so that's how we get to that place in service date. Next slide. And here I'll let Danielle kind of dive into more of the data on PSH.
Yeah, so one of the first things we did as we started thinking about what an approach would look like and what's the right tool that we should pick, we wanted to look at what the needs are. So we did a lot of data-driven analysis around homelessness and what it can tell us about the households who might need this intervention. So across the state of Maryland, in the last year, we had about 4,300 people who were considered chronically homeless. 16% of all the people who experience homelessness in a year for our state. And the vast majority of those are adult-only households, either singles or couples. And so as a proxy, we're considering those likely one-bedroom unit needs. And then we also have about 13% families with children. So we're assuming 2+ bedrooms in those situations. We also have a growing population of elderly people experiencing homelessness. And so while those aren't specifically who we're targeting on the basis of age, within that chronically homeless group, we recognize there's also people who are reaching a certain age and might need an additional level of support. So those are all of our stats for those different groups across the state. We also looked at a couple of interesting data points to help guide our decision making. One was that 68% of people who are chronically homeless have zero cash income, according to HMIS. And so as we're thinking about how to make this housing affordable, it is absolutely required for us to layer a subsidy. So the vast majority of LIHTC units are affordable at 60% AMI. When averaged across all the different types. And so what we need is an additional subsidy to bring the cost of that unit and the rent contribution down to match people where they are, which is closer to 0 to 10% AMI for the vast majority of people. We also know, based on our data, that 67% of our chronically homeless households have a permanent physical disability. Again, I mentioned a good portion of folks are elderly adults. And so as we think about the types of units that need to be constructed, we also need to look at accessibility of the unit itself and making sure that people can age in place independently once they are placed into those units. We also are focusing on this from a housing first perspective and looking at how we can adopt policies that support a low barrier entrance. So whether that be criminal background or credit history or savings levels or anything like that, we are looking to be as low barrier as possible. And we also know, to Nicole's point earlier, the three-legged stool is quickly becoming the fourth-legged stool, where we really need to make sure the behavioral health needs of individuals are being met. And so we know that 69% of our households we're planning to serve have a mental health diagnosis, 40% have a substance use disorder. So as we're thinking about what the service package should look like, strong connections to behavioral health and other types of supportive services are really critical. And then geographic diversity. The other thing that influenced this is we, at this stage, because we're in the beginning of this process, we know that we have a high level of need for permanent supportive housing in every part of the state. There's sort of a minimum level of at least 50 people in every jurisdiction of the state are chronically homeless. So for at least a few years, we can sort of, prioritize PSH or create PSH preferences at a even level across the state to raise the bar for everyone. I think down the line, we might have to revisit that strategy as we address chronic homelessness in some of maybe our rural or smaller jurisdictions where maybe we don't have quite as high rates. So as we looked at what's the right strategy for this first year, we ended up landing on a threshold requirement, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But I do want to caveat that with that might not need to be our strategy in a few years. We might need to rethink that as we make progress on these goals. Next slide. So we made a couple of assumptions when we were looking at what's the best way to arrive at the right approach. So we're assuming the vast majority of units need to be 1 bedrooms. We know the average household has annual income below or at 10% AMI. We also, did some comparison with what would the cost to subsidize affordable housing properties look like versus just doing a tenant-based voucher, and did some math comparison there about affordability. We also are coming into this with an assumption that we're going to aim for no more than 15 clients for every case manager or tenancy support services worker. That could be lower at some point, depending on the level of need that we are seeing. So anywhere between 10 to 15 per person as we're figuring out what the supportive services package and funding should look like. We also assume an annual turnover of about 5% of permanent supportive housing. In some of our jurisdictions, that can go up to 10%. It just depends on the nature of the housing being offered, but anywhere between 5 and 10% turnover for PSH. We also know that the Medicaid 1115 waiver is not going to cover all of the costs for supportive services. So there are other types of costs that need to be covered. So we know that we need to also incorporate additional funding for those services providers that goes beyond what can be covered under Medicaid. And if we had our ideal system, and we are not there yet, but if we had our ideal system, we would be doing a mix of project-based rental assistance with site-based housing and tenant-based, because the reality is that most people don't want to live in the same building the rest of their life. They want to be able to live, maybe closer to their job, or maybe they have a child who goes to a certain school and they want to move at some point. So we are already thinking about what should tenant mobility look like and relocation needs look like. Right now, we're really focused on how do we get the project-based rental assistance in place, because that's the first step. But very quickly thereafter are going to be looking at how do we create mobility for the people that need to move on. And then we also assume that generally the cost for subsidy and services is going to rise every year due to inflation and other increases in rent costs, things like that. So we target that about 5 to 7%. Next slide. So we looked at a range of options for how to incentivize more PSH. Generally, there's kind of 3 strategies we see most communities use. And to arrive at our decision, I literally read like 40 QAPs. So thank you to those of you that have those on your websites or have published those. Recently, we did a lot of research around what are all the different options people are using. So option 1 is using a set aside, which is creating a pool of credits that are only available to projects that agree to set aside a certain number of units. So not every project has to do that. It's just those that want to. It's an opt-in. We also looked at a threshold requirement. So having every single project that receives LIHTC have to have a certain percentage of PSH units in it. And additional points. So as was mentioned, tax credits, particularly 9%, are very competitive. And so often extra points can be the thing that results in more applications to do PSH or incorporate PSH. And then some states we noticed are using a variety of those tools and combining different strategies. Next slide. So for us, where we landed was doing a threshold requirement. That was for a couple of different key reasons. One is the volume of units we're talking about creating. So if we're really serious about making 500 to 600 units a year, that means that we need to have every project in the state incorporate PSH. It needs to just be part of our normal way of doing business. And so we landed at 15%. You might be asking yourself, why 15%? Greg mentioned we produce about 4,000 units on average per year. So to get to 500, that's 15%. So right now, that's the threshold we're considering. That could change a little bit between now and our final version. We're kind of working on the math to make sure that that's the right level. But we would expect all projects, whether 9% or 4%, to dedicate 15% of their units to PSH. And obviously projects vary in size. And so if it's a smaller project, it would be a minimum of 5 units. The plan is right now to have a state funded subsidy or state matched subsidy to cover that affordability gap in rent costs, and to pair the supportive services for all the units that we would create. Obviously, none of us can anticipate what's going to happen in a future budget year. One kind of challenge as well as gift about working in the site-based PSH and new construction is that we don't create units overnight. We do have a ramp up period where many of the projects are not going to be ready to lease for 2, maybe even 3 years while they're under construction. So we have a little bit of time to do all this matching and braiding work, but in the case that we were to have a year where the subsidy falls through, or the state can't find a voucher to pair with a unit, or the supportive services funds aren't available, we still want to be able to use these units to benefit folks who are experiencing homelessness. So if we get into a situation where the project is ready to be placed into service in the near future, and we don't have those things lined up, we essentially convert to a homeless preference, either in part or in whole, for any units we don't have a subsidy for. If that converts to a regular homeless preference, we would then target that assistance to individuals who are just kind of a normal referral. So it could be someone coming from the COC who has a PSH subsidy or a rapid rehousing subsidy and just needs an affordable unit. It could be a working family who has enough earned income to meet the typical LIHTC income requirements. So it would convert to a homeless preference, still benefit homeless families, but would not necessarily be permanent supportive housing. Next slide. So there's a lot of different partners we know this is going to take to pull off. At the state, the role we envision for ourselves is as convener, chief cat herder, and this braider role, right? So in this scenario, to do this right, we believe that we need to be involved in the project-based rental assistance, securing that, and also pairing it with properties. Sometimes hopefully leveraging vouchers from local public housing authorities, which may or may not be available, but we will always try to leverage those. Matching the supportive services providers. So working with our partners at the Maryland Department of Health as those new providers get certified under the Medicaid 1115 waiver, strategically pairing them with the units that are coming online through this QAP process. And then we would also play a role in the referral and matching process of these units as they come online with our local continuums of care. And in the model we're developing, all the referrals for these units would come from the coordinated entry by name list for each COC. And then we also have a state homeless services data warehouse that takes all of the local COC HMIS data, puts it into one warehouse, and at some point when these projects come online, we'll actually be able to monitor housing outcomes, income outcomes, and other types of programmatic outcomes to make sure that we're not just putting people in housing, but we're actually giving them all the services to stay there successfully. In our model, the property manager or owner would be obviously responsible for developing quality and accessible units. They would accept those referrals directly from the COC and exclusively from the COC. We would ask them to have a low barrier tenant selection plan and or to limit barriers where they can, and also complete some state provided training and technical assistance from us. So I envision us providing some training to property managers, for example, on trauma-informed care, working with households who are coming directly out of homelessness, and just kind of equipping them with the skills to handle tenancy issues that might be coming up, that maybe they're not used to, or maybe presenting a challenge for the community. And then when possible, we are hopeful that they could set aside maybe some office or meeting space for case management visits that aren't inside the unit. The COC would be responsible for making all of those referrals. So one of the things we're going to have to work on with each COC is making sure that their coordinated entry system is capable and ready to make fast referrals and to properly screen for eligibility. Many of them already, especially in urban areas, already do this. But in our rural areas, we are going to provide an extra level of training and TA to our COCs to get them ready for this new volume of units that would potentially be available for them. And then we would also want to leverage our COC support with move-on strategies. So for those tenants who maybe are needing to move, or maybe they're just ready for a lower level of care, maybe they just want a subsidy and they want to move to a regular unit, they don't want supportive services anymore, looking at how can we move them on to other forms of assistance that the COC might have access to already. And then on the part of the service provider, it's what you would expect, providing really comprehensive wraparound services to each household, and primarily operating through a lens of voluntary participation and a housing first model. Next slide. Okay, and then I think this might be the last, or maybe we have one more, but a couple of things we're just thinking about as we plan for this. We are not necessarily going to follow the HUD definition of chronically homeless. So we are looking at creating something that is more expansive, more inclusive of different housing settings. We have a real need in Maryland to focus not just on folks who are in a street outreach or unsheltered setting or emergency shelter, but we have a lot of folks coming out of institutional settings who were homeless immediately prior to entry. And as we all know, one of the challenges with the chronic homeless definition, or just homeless definition, is once someone's been in an institutional setting for 90 days, they lose that homeless status and therefore access to traditional HUD resources through the continuum of care. So we're looking at how can this program maybe help fill that gap? How can we maybe create something that's a little bit more inclusive? And we also are looking at how can we create something that requires less documentation than what HUD does under the COC program, and a slightly more expansive definition of disability. So we're looking to sort of fill some gaps in the housing system that we've picked up on with our continuums of care, and really kind of lower the barrier at entry to make sure that the referral process can be as fast as possible. Another thing that we're going to be working on is ensuring that folks who have disabilities and are engaged with service providers, but maybe not with a homeless service provider, have access to homeless resources through the COC. So we do have a number of folks who are being served by like a behavioral health provider and are unsheltered, but are not being served by the COC. So looking at how can we get more agencies to be assessors for coordinated entry so that those folks have access to the HUD funded resources as well. So this has been a great opportunity to sort of help our COCs rethink how they do that work, how they partner with institutions, how they partner with other sectors, and making sure that the COC coordinated entry process is accessible to everybody who needs it. And then for quality supportive housing, we want to make sure that we're really working with fidelity to the evidence-based practices. So providing a lot of training and technical assistance to not just owners and property managers, but also our supportive services providers, and regularly doing assessments for fidelity to quality supportive housing. And primarily this would be with the Corporation for Supportive Housing's tools. We really like those. So we are looking at adopting those in our practice. And then again, I already mentioned this, but planning for the future. So tenants who need to move on, tenants who have relocation needs, whether that be because of accessibility or income or any other number of reasons that are really good to move on from your current unit. We want to create mobility and participant choice. So those are a couple of the things we're working through now. And I'm hopeful, you know, by the time we put out our final plan, we'll have a lot of these kind of figured out by then. Okay, and I don't think we have any more slides. Just our contact info. So we're happy to do any follow-up questions or also hear ideas from others. Like I shared, we're in the middle of the process. And so it sounds like in the next few weeks, we're going to have a lot more clarity about where we're going, but we're really excited. This is, it feels very fast. We're going really from like 0 to 60 on PSH. And I was joking earlier, like, our secretary has been given the honorary nickname of like pedal to the metal secretary day. And so we are making big system changes, which often, you know, to be frank, feels very scary and, you know, it is a huge change for us. But if we do it right, if we really commit to doing the work, could be transformational. It really could make a huge difference in the outcomes that we're seeing. So we're both excited, but also, you know, happy to take lessons learned from other places and hear how other folks are doing. And I feel like the TA and the community of support we've built over last year with you all has been really helpful to informing our plan. So thanks in advance to everybody who, you know, dealt with one of my phone calls or one of my emails asking for your guidance or your information or your plans over the last 12 months. It's been incredibly helpful.
And
Thanks so
Danielle,
much.
I'll just add, you know, for specific questions about the QAP or any technical questions, you see my colleague Katie Waterman. She wasn't able to join us today, but she is the guru for our QAP, and she'd be happy to take any questions. So she can be reached at katiewaterman1@maryland.gov.
Before we close out, we want to thank again our Maryland presenters and Nicole, and we appreciate all who contributed to the discussion. Please stay with us for a few important announcements and requests. First, you may be thinking that you're off the hook for the session evaluation. That's not the case. We really are counting on you to complete this evaluation. It helps us know if this session is on target and make improvements that you might see shaping what we offer in the next HSPA cohort. So please complete the evaluation for this session by next Friday. You can grab the link from the QR code or the chat, and we'll also send it again tomorrow by email. Next slide, please. To help you plan, we're giving you a heads up. The next month, we're going to ask the state teams to help us evaluate the Accelerator. And in December, your coaching support will wrap up as it is today. And we're planning a final session on December 12th, which will celebrate your successes and share lessons learned. And looking ahead to 2025, the federal partners want to help you maintain the momentum. And we are really excited to announce some optional ongoing support for this first cohort of HSPA. And we'll have more information and details for you in December, but we're really excited to provide the opportunity to continue technical assistance for this really important work. Next slide, please. The TA community site will remain open and expand with the new HSPA cohort that will be sharing additional information also at the end of October. So stay tuned for that. And as usual, next week, we'll upload the recording from today. Next slide, please. And over the course of these 8 learning track sessions, we've learned so much together, and we hope you'll continue to use the materials and recordings in the coming months as you continue to strengthen your housing-related supports and services. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you in December. And last slide, as always, we just really want to make sure we thank all of our wonderful technical assistance providers who have been instrumental in making this a really valuable experience. So thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your week, and see you in December.